as far as books on, if you want a book on Hebrew thought, right there, and I'm sure I tried to go through my own brain and some notes and to see what all is out there. So I'm sure I'm missing some books out there, but I don't think I'm missing any books on Hebraic thought that came out, like it's actually looking at the philosophy of the Bible itself. So when I talk about scholars who are, or books and scholars who are working on this, I'm really talking about people who kind of think the way that we're talking about. They think there's some intellectual world under these biblical texts that gets expressed in certain ways, or there's some conceptual world that you can explore by tracing it within a book or across books. And so I guess these books that I'm going to highlight are people who are in principle in agreement, I think, with what we're trying to do or what we think is important here. And then you'll find it expressed in the things that they write. And that'll be from scholarly all the way down to what I consider basically academic, which means, if you have a college degree, you can probably read it and appreciate what they're saying. Do you want to go through all of these? I'm happy to.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and again, I am so sorry if I have any of my colleague friends who are listening and I did not mention your book. You should absolutely tell us, and we'll flag it up in the Drew Missed Books section of this podcast. But I think of someone like the Jewish scholar, Israeli scholar, Beryl Dove Lerner, who's a philosopher by training, but he's a religious Jew, and he's an Israeli. He reads Hebrew. He speaks Hebrew as part of his daily life, speaks Arabic as well. And so he has deep contact with the Hebrew Scriptures. He wrote this book, Human-Divine Interactions in the Hebrew Scriptures, Covenants at Cross Purpose. Fascinating book. I'm actually, full disclosure, an editor on the series that he wrote that book with. So I actually brought him into that series because he told me about the book, and I was like, ooh, that might be a good one for our series. But again, if you want to see a Jewish philosopher kind of digging into the Hebrew Bible and saying, what happens when gods interact with humans according to the thinking of the Hebrew Bible? And then going down into stories and law and poetry and figuring out how they tease these things out. Great. He's a great man. He's a mensch, as they say. Wonderful guy, wonderful scholar. Another one that I really love, this is actually based, it's Matt Lynch, a friend of mine who I do another podcast with, but he wrote this book for Cambridge University Press called Portraying Violence in the Hebrew Bible. And it is straight up Hebraic thought of violence in the Bible. It's a brilliant book. It's very sensitive to how the biblical authors portray violence. So you might be offended by the violence of Joshua, Jericho. Some people might even think that's genocide, whatever they want to call that. He says, okay, fine. But how do the biblical authors portray this? How do they conceptualize violence? And so, it's very surprising. You don't find any language of violence in the book of Joshua, which is the exact place you'd expect to find it, right? So he has a book that's actually very accessible, very readable by lay people called Flood and Fury, Old Testament Violence and the Shalom of God, where he actually works that all the way into Christianity. So the technical book was a Cambridge Press book, and it was a monograph, but that one he actually works out into how it works out in Christianity. One on the topic of justice is by a guy, Michael Rhodes. So if you've seen our video kind of introducing Hebraic thought from Washington, D.C. and Israel and all that, Michael Rhodes is in that video. And he has a book that just came out this year called Just Discipleship, Biblical Justice in an Unjust World. And he's tying together, he does both Old and New Testament quite nicely. He's an Old Testament professor now, but he actually worked in the New Testament in Corinthians for a while. And he ties together the concept of discipleship in the New Testament with the concept of justice in the Torah and the Pentateuch. And so it's a great book. He's somebody who has lived, he's walked the walk. He doesn't just talk the talk. He comes into scholarship after working on economic development and justice down in the streets for years and years. So he's a great guy as well. Another book, and this one might seem like completely out of source, and I haven't read it yet. I just know the people involved, and so I'm just assuming it's going to be good. Caillou Paris and Peter Altman. Caillou is going to be a new research fellow for us. He, again, is a Brazilian who lives in Brazil, works with street kids. Him and his wife have worked with traumatized street kids for years. That's what he does for a living, but he's also an independent scholar. He's written articles for us on the Center for Hebraic Thought. He's a brilliant thinker, and I think his work with real people has basically shaped his scholarship in such a way that it's just oozes with on-the-ground insights. So he and Peter Altman wrote this numbers commentary for the Tyndale Old Testament commentary series that just came out, or it's coming out this month, I think, in the United States. So that'd be another one that I know whatever he's going to say about numbers, because I've seen some of the things he says about numbers, it's going to have these insights informed from this kind of Hebraic thought perspective. Okay, I'm going to take a break there. Any questions about those, or are you just thinking like, okay, is that too much? Or because I got four or five more I want to talk about.
No, I think it's all extremely helpful, and the diversity of resources from both the authors as well as the topic matter, I think helps people see just how fully orbed Hebraic thought is or can be, or it informs current topics of conversation. It also very much is at work in its own situation in life, if you will. And so that's great. I'm actually just curious to hear what other resources you have.
Well, it's going to be a wild collection here as well.
Okay.
With some New Testament stuff as well here. So this one is a textbook, but again, Heath Thomas is one of the authors. Mark Gillinet is the other author, and Heath is on our board for the Center for Hebraic Thought. He's the president of Oklahoma Baptist University, and he's also a fantastic scholar of what we call the minor prophets in the Christian world. The book is called Reading the Old Testament as Christian Scripture. So it's meant to be used as a classroom textbook, and it's coming out this month or next. And again, Heath is one of my early friends. When I started getting into academics, I somehow stumbled into him. He's a wonderful human being, and he's a great scholar, and he helped me realize that, I wasn't the only one who was thinking about the text this way, and it actually gave me a lot of confidence, he and a few other people, about what we were doing. Okay, so that's a textbook for like a freshman, sophomore class, undergraduate on the Old Testament. The next one is called Wine, Soil, and Salvation in the Hebrew Bible and New Testament. This is by Mark Scarlatta, which you've heard me interview him before. He wrote a great book for Christians on Leviticus. And now he's looking at what is the relationship between wine, soil, and salvation. I can tell you right now, this is going to be an amazingly fascinating book. Mark is one of us. He thinks Hebraically just by nature. He values this idea of concept development in Scripture and tracing that across. And you can imagine, I'm just going to leave it as a cliffhanger, how are wine, soil, and redemption and salvation connected together. But that's a great book to look forward to coming out this year. Jason Staples, who's also been on the podcast, had a book that came out this last year, Paul and the Resurrection of Israel, within the last year and a half or so, I think. And again, just looking really closely at these old conceptions we have of Paul. Paul teaches salvation by faith, no works, and we've even gotten some comments on the social media. I noticed about one of the things I said about this, that, it touches a nerve with Protestants when you say, well, actually, Paul was, yes, but he was doing way more than that. So this book is, what's the way more that he's doing? Another book that's coming out in a few months, Jesus and the Law of Moses by Paul Sloan. Again, I have not read it yet, but knowing Paul and knowing his work, it's going to be fantastic. And it's basically going to be that question, what do Christians have to do with the old rituals, the law of Moses, keeping the law, all that stuff we saw in the New Testament? What does it have to do with Christianity? People ask me that all the time. Do we have to keep any of those laws? It seems like some of those things are actually still important. Seems like some of them we couldn't do even if we wanted to. And so Paul's going to work some or most of that out with Jesus's view on these things. Okay, and then finally, I have two more. One is one by Trevor Lawrence, who we've interviewed about this book, but he's got a new book coming out based on this big fat book called Cursing with God, the Imprecatory Psalms, as the ethics of Christian prayer. If you haven't heard that interview I did with him, it's fascinating. He takes imprecatory psalms all the way down into public shaming on Twitter.
Wow.
He has thought about this, and quite honestly, he's lived through some experiences as a pastor in a church, where he's actually had to feel his way forward. These are not just a guy who's interested in imprecatory psalms. He's somebody who's lived with this and thought about this very deeply, and he's got it worked out in his head how it all fits together. And when he explained it to me, I was like, that is amazing. And so a great thinker, a great human being again. And then this one I have...
Actually, Drew, if I could, for any of our listeners or folks watching us on YouTube, if you are curious, this is not the Trevor Lawrence quarterback in the NFL that we are referring to.
Who does he play for?
Yes, this is another person altogether. So in case anybody was curious.
This Trevor Lawrence is probably cooler than that Trevor Lawrence. But who knows? The NFL Trevor Lawrence might be a cool guy too.
Yeah.
But this Trevor Lawrence has some amazing things to say. So he has a new book, and I don't remember the name of it, but it's coming out this year. It's going to be based on this much thicker book with Baylor University Press. So he's writing a more accessible book for normal people. And then I haven't read this one either, but again, I know his work. Paul as the Storyteller, a Narratological Approach. This is Christoph Heilig. And again, we think of Paul as writing shrewd arguments in kind of the Roman rhetorical style. And I think he's going to, again, knowing him, I think he's going to say, hey, we have this narrative theology and this narrative approach to text. Let's think about the kinds of stories that Paul both appeals to and creates within his rhetoric. And so I assume, I don't even know if Christopher Heilig would want to be associated with Hebraic thought movement, but I'm going to assume that some of the things he's saying there are going to have lots of fruits for the way we think are good for investigating scriptures.